Well, I was born and grew up in Los Angeles, and my mother was a single parent clerical worker. We lived with my grandmother, who was a garment worker, a milliner, hat maker, worked in the hat making factories in LA. And after I graduated from high school, I worked for quite a few years in gas stations and was involved in some of my first sort of workplace actions there. And it was during that sort of period, and this is related to being from, working class origin, developing my own class consciousness. And that was in the 60s, and there was also a lot of things going on then. There was the whole black freedom struggle and the anti-war movement at that time, which also sort of influenced my thinking and I think it was being subject to the power of the bosses and looking at the history of my family and these are the things that led me to kind of develop a loyalty to the working class consciousness. And it was during that period, and it was also and my radicalism sort of came out of that, because gradually during the 60s that I started moving to the left and was initially sort of, reading various kinds of socialist literature and was influenced by the ideas of the left wing of the old American Socialist Party, people like Gene Debs and Mary Marcy, and by British Guild Socialism, people like G.D.H. Cole. And because I was interested in the question of how does the working class escape or liberate itself from being subject to bosses and direct oppression in the class sense. And so that led me to those forms of socialism that emphasize worker direct management of production. You can see how that's going to... so worker self-management became an important sort of ideal for me, right? So I sort of was interested in the libertarian forms of socialism. And I can't really say exactly... I tend not to identify that much as an anarchist, and I'll explain why, but tended to identify as first a socialist, right, and interpreted that more in a libertarian way. But there was a group in LA in the late 60s called The Resistance, and it was a draft resistance group, but they were explicitly anarcho-syndicalists, and it was one of the people in that group who I was organizing a union at that time. This would be in the 70s. And we were organizing a teaching assistants union at UCLA. I started working there as a teaching assistant in 1970. And it was a very grassroots independent union. It was run we had department assemblies, meetings, and delegates, shop stewards. And the union as a whole was coordinated by the shop stewards committee, and I was the shop steward for my department. And so this one friend, a fellow student there, was the first person to sort of introduce me to the idea of anarcho-syndicalism and to tell me about the Spanish Revolution. I had up to that point didn't know there was a revolution in Spain, never heard of it. And that was that period in the 70s, I guess, when I began to develop a critique of electoral politics, because starting out as a socialist, I believed in direct action and workplace organizing, development of democratic unions, but I still was sort of thinking in terms of also supporting some kind of working class electoral political party, that kind of thing. It was really towards the latter part of the 70s I began to reject that, to critique that idea. There was there was a New Left group, the New American Movement, that I was a member of for a while in the early 70s. The person who kind of influenced me to join that was Stoughton Lynd. Stoughton Lynd is a libertarian Marxist. He's still around. He was quite influential in the 60s, 70s period in the U.S. And he was one of the initial people involved in organizing that political group. And so I joined that group, and there was a libertarian socialist tendency within it, which I was a part of, and most of the libertarian socialists quit in 1974 and left. So that was kind of the period when I was becoming more of a libertarian socialist, was in the 70s. And we, the late 70s, I was living in Milwaukee. I left LA and was in a group in Milwaukee that was a part of an organization called the Anarchist Communist Federation. It was formed in 1978. There had been in the 60s, there really weren't, I should point out, there were in the 60s, 70s period in the U.S., there weren't really that many anarchists or libertarian socialists around, not as many as today. They were a much smaller proportion of the left. The radical left was much larger in that period, but it was dominated by a Marxist-Leninist politics. Maoism was very big in that period. There were thousands of Maoists. So there had been an anarchist entity called the Social Revolutionary Anarchist Federation in the 60s. But it was nothing more than a discussion bulletin. It was anything goes, kind of loose arrangement. It had a lot of really crazy ideas of various individuals. So I really didn't, I mean, I got the newsletter, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. But there were some people in it who were more serious about sort of working class oriented type of anarchist politics. That's how the Anarchist Communist Federation was formed, and I participated in the group in Milwaukee. And it was sort of out of that organization, even though it didn't last long, that I met a number of the people who I would eventually work with in forming the Workers' Solidarity Alliance, which still exists, and I'm still a member of it. And the Workers' Solidarity Alliance was formed in 1984. But before that, when the Anarchist Communist Federation broke up, and one of the lessons that I would make from that experience, I should mention, is that the Anarchist Communist Federation was formed from sort of pre-existing collectives. It was a federation in that sense. So although it had a very coherent political statement, the groups had a different identity, a different local kind of politics that they had developed through their own internal discussions and so forth. So the political statement, as it turned out, simply papered over what were really underlying disagreements. And so that once the organization was formed, these disagreements then began to surface. Whenever we would try to strategize or think about what we would want to focus on, what we would do, the different political perspectives made for intractable disagreements, intractable, just unending arguments. Okay, so it's an example of how having separate groups of their own sort of ideology come together got in the way of being able to do anything. So, and that organization broke up in 1980. So then we had an informal conference, those of us who quit, in 1981 in New York City, and we formed a magazine. We decided to kind of, have our own magazine to put out our political perspective. as a way of, arguing for our ideas and pulling together people to form a new organization. And that was the origin of our magazine, Ideas in Action. And I moved here to San Francisco at that time in 1981. I was coming back to California. So we put out that magazine, I would say, about twice a year. And we also had a conference of anarcho-syndicalists and libertarian socialists here in California. In, I think, 82 or 83, something like that. And then in 1984, the Workers' Solidarity Alliance had its founding conference in New York City. And, there were people from who had been in several different anarchist groups, people who had been in the IWW, who had left the IWW. And so we founded it as an anarcho-syndicalist political organization at that conference.